There are a couple of things I want you to take away from this lecture on the prophets. First of all, you should walk away from this lecture understanding the various markers for a biblical prophet and the structure of the prophetic material found in our Bibles. Second, the prophets are responding to their context. The historical and cultural context of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament prophecy is the period of the Israelite and Judean monarchies through the Babylonian exile into the early post-exilic period. During this time, the ancient Israelites suffered tremendously under both domestic, unethical kings and foreign, enemy conquest, oppression. And the prophets are responding to their reality. Finally, the prophets approach their circumstances from their particular perspectives. Neither are the perspectives of Hosea and Amos the same, or are the perspectives of 1st Isaiah and Micah. There is no text without context. I will provide a brief overview of the social world, the world behind the text, depicted in the prophetic literature found in our Bibles. I will highlight the international concerns of those living in the area east of the Mediterranean Sea during the 8th century BCE. Here, the historical and social rationale for the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests serve as the backdrop that frames what 8th century prophets like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah had to say about the goings-on in the area. In this lecture, I will attend to the domestic concerns of Israel and Judah during this time. I will focus on important characters and events, but I posted some videos on your learning management system site for those who want to dig deeper. To be clear, there's much that could be said about the biblical prophets and their text. I realize this survey course does not make room for a deep dive into the prophets, so if this lecture whets your appetite for more, I encourage you to consult the bibliography I have included as part of your syllabus to direct your further research. First, a word about prophets in the Bible. The biblical text uses the terms Navi, male prophet, and Naviah, female prophet, to describe people who engage in a broad range of interpretive practices and inquiry techniques. Prophets are depicted as religious intermediaries whose function it is to carry messages back and forth between human beings and a deity. Persons performing this social function have been found in a wide range of times, places, and societies. The prophet is not unique to the 8th century BCE, the geographic area known as the Levant, or the ancient Israelites. Now, a word about the biblical canon. You may remember this slide from an earlier lecture. The second of the three divisions of the Hebrew Bible canon, the prophets, may be subdivided into the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and the latter prophets, which includes the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the minor prophets, or the Book of the 12. The Book of the 12 is simply the collection of the shorter prophetic books in the Hebrew canon, Hosea through Malachi. Some use the term major and minor to distinguish between these texts. This nomenclature is misleading because it suggests that texts like Zephaniah are less important than texts like Isaiah. In reality, the prophetic materials were most probably written on scrolls. Because the texts of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel were longer, they required larger or bigger scrolls. These big scroll texts were considered major, while the smaller texts, which required less scroll material, were considered minor. It is that simple. If you flip through your Bibles, you will see the difference in the size or length of these texts. You should think about the designation difference as about size, not value. Context. This slide provides a broad historical overview of ancient Israel. At this point in Israel's history, Solomon is no longer king, and the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the area we refer to as Mesopotamia, was divided into northern and southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom, or Israel, had consolidated power in Samaria, and leaders such as Jeroboam, Ahab, Jehu, and Jeroboam II, and Hoshea will rule. The southern kingdom, or Judah, has consolidated power in Jerusalem, and leaders such as Rehoboam, Athaliah, and Uzziah will rule. You will remember Uzziah as the ruler mentioned in the famous call of Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Somewhere around 720 BCE, Israel became subject to Assyria. When Assyria conquered Israel, Judah was impacted. Eventually, Babylon will come to power, and Nebuchadnezzar II and his army will conquer Judah and deport select members of the community to Babylonia. This is the famous exile of which biblical heroes like Ezra and Nehemiah speak. The goings-on in the various states and empires of the ancient Near East during the 8th century BCE reminds me of the carnival game Whack-A-Mole. As soon as one state emerged as dominant, it was whacked by another. That state dominated for a period, and then it was whacked. This chaotic kingdom dominance pattern continued for centuries with Assyria, Babylonia, Israel, Judah, and Egypt, each popping up as a mole or holding the hammer and whacking a mole in this 18th century carnival game. So very quickly, led by Shalmaneser III, Assyria held the hammer and whacked away at the various Levant territories. After Shalmaneser III died, the kingdom of Arutu rose to its greatest power. Arutu whacked away at neighboring territories to the point that Assyria was on the verge of extinction when Tiglath-Pileser III, or TP3 as I like to call him, came to the Assyrian throne. TP3 whacked away and quickly regained all the territory that Assyria had lost after Shalmaneser III's death. In response to Assyria, a group of smaller kingdoms of the Levant formed a coalition. These coalition kingdoms kept popping up, and Assyria kept whacking away at them. Down in the southern kingdom, Judah apparently refused to join this coalition, so the kings of the coalition laid siege on Jerusalem in what is called the Syro-Ephraimite War. Following TP3, Shalmaneser V is credited with conquering Israel in 722 BCE. Sargon II came along and added new regions to the Assyrian Empire. Sargon II's son, Sennacherib, focused his whack-a-mole energies on Jerusalem, because not only did Jerusalem refuse submission to Assyria, but it also allied itself with Assyria's enemies. In the meantime, Babylonia popped back up and became unfriendly towards Assyria, so Sennacherib had to conquer Babylon. Sennacherib eventually drove out the king of Babylon, and after fierce fighting, utterly destroyed the city, killing all or driving out all of its inhabitants in 689 BCE. Assyria whacked Babylon. Babylon would later whack Assyria and emerge as the ancient Near Eastern superpower. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon would conquer Judah, and the Babylonian exile would leave Judah empty for years. At least that is how the biblical writers would describe the Judean territory. All of this history is important because these events pressed upon the people of the biblical text. It is this frenzied, stressful, harsh, desperate context that gives rise to the material found in the prophets. The prophets are responding to their context. Understandably, when Shalmaneser V conquered Samaria, the capital of Israel, in 722 BCE, and Sargon II began to deport Israelites per the Assyrian exile process, the people were devastated. The people would have been devastated because these would have been the same people who just years ago enjoyed the social and economic benefits of a vibrant community under a centralized monarchy. Archaeological surveys in places like Hazar, Megiddo, Gezer, Beersheba, and Lachish all point to a vibrant community in the Levant during the time of the monarchy. This time was marked by urban-based hierarchical settlement patterns. We have cities, towns, and villages. Architectural variety, we see palaces, sanctuaries, storage facilities, stables, private houses, and small industrial complexes. Political centralization. In the north, Israel became a state with taxing and conscripting powers and developed a standing army and was marked by hierarchical bureaucracies. And social stratification. Royals, elites, members of the priestly class, commoners, peasants, slaves, each experienced life very differently. Consider the devastation of even the Assyrian conquest from both a historical and cultural perspective. What might it have been like to live in Samaria when the Assyrians finally came to town? Let's imagine. What from the Collins chapter helps you think about what it may have been like in Samaria? And then in the southern kingdom, Judah must have been watching and wondering about its vulnerability. When Nebuchadnezzar arrives, Judah lives its greatest fear: conquest and exile. Can you imagine? So we have Israel and Judah seemingly minding their own business, and along comes Assyria. The inhabitants of both the northern and southern kingdom must have wondered why their God Yahweh did not protect them from their foreign oppressors. The burning questions would have been, what happened? How did we get here? What did we do wrong? I now turn to the work of a select group of prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, to explore how some 8th century prophets try to answer these questions. I know you know about Amos and Hosea, and you've probably read or may even have listened to a sermon from the books ascribed to them. An important thing to remember about Amos is that although he is writing about the North, he was from the South. Not only was he from the South, Amos was associated with Tekoa, which was a small town in the South. His outsider status undoubtedly informed his prophetic perspective. As a shepherd, Amos was part of the underclass of Judah, and his social standing may have fueled his passion around the social injustices of Israel's elite. Hosea, on the other hand, was a northerner who prophesied in the north. It seems Hosea experienced much of the chaos associated with Assyria's prolonged campaign against Israel. Historical references in Hosea's book date all the way from Jeroboam II's reign through the rise of TP3 to the cusp of the fall of Israel in 722 BCE. When Hosea talks about an Assyrian threat, he is speaking from up close and personal experience. For him, the threat of an Assyrian takeover is not philosophical or theoretical, but it is very real. While Amos is concerned about social injustice, Hosea attributes Israel's crises to its infidelity to Yahweh. Specifically, he places blame squarely on the shoulders of inept kings and a corrupt priesthood. Remember, prophets tend to critique leadership. Here are some other things and concerns found in Amos and Hosea that you should be familiar with. Oracles, or the oracle against the nation. By definition, an oracle is someone or something acting as a medium through whom advice or prophecy was sought from the gods in classical antiquity. You may remember the character played by Gloria Foster in the Matrix movie. Here, the oracle pointed Neo in the direction of his destiny. In the biblical text, oracles express the prophetic belief that Yahweh controlled all history. The day of the Lord. Amos is the first prophet to use this term. Its primary imagery is military, in which God is portrayed as a divine warrior who will come to fight against his enemies. Hosea leverages the marriage metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. Love is a battlefield. Joe is a couch potato. Baby, you're a firework. All metaphors. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the exilic Isaiah, and Malachi also employ this metaphor, but we credit the prophets with conceiving the idea of Yahweh as the husband in their attempt to graphically portray God's covenant election of Israel. Hosea was the first prophet to significantly advance the marriage metaphor. And so it's in Hosea's case, his own marriage to Gomer is intricately connected to his meditation on Israel's marriage to Yahweh. And then we have the parent-child metaphor. Here, the image of God as a parent in Hosea 11:1-4 is gender neutral. But what does it mean to envision God as a parent? Have you seen this metaphor used before? Do you remember what does Bird have to say about Hosea in her chapter, Violence, the Language everyone understands. Bird shares about being disturbed by the use of the first two chapters of Hosea at a woman's weekend retreat. Bird then goes on to point out most of the prophets used symbolic language and communicated messages that fell into two categories: warnings and encouragement. Before we move on to Isaiah and Micah, let's look closely at the book of Amos. I invite you to open your Bibles, take notes in your margins, and underline portions for future reference. So, big picture, the biblical scholar J. Gordon McConville divides the book of Amos into three major sections. First, Amos accuses foreign nations. Second, judgment speeches and oracles against Israel. And then third, vision. After establishing his prophecy as seeing in chapter 1, verse 1, Amos quickly moves to a series of oracles. Amos is unusual in beginning with these, although the form is found in several of the prophetic books. We see it in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. The oracles against the nations begin with the regular formula. For these 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. The turning of the oracles on Judah and Israel seems odd. A close read of the text reveals the oracles are what McConville calls a lead up to the real point. Let's look at Amos 2, 6 through 16. As you review these passages, pay particular attention to what is said about debt slavery, sexual offense, and rebellion. Because of its special relationship with Yahweh, Israel is held to a higher standard regarding matters of justice and debt slavery. After some rhetorical questions at the beginning of the 3rd chapter, the second part of the book introduces court language or a legal metaphor. We will see this throughout the prophets and later in the wisdom writings. This section contains interesting treatments of the feminine as the prophetic personifications of cities and various calls for justice and righteousness. Also, the idea that the people are God's elect people is very similar to the notion of chosen in the Abraham arc in Genesis. In the 3rd and final portion of Amos, readers find Amos acting in the prophet's traditional role as intercessor. Let us consider Amos 7, 1 through 6. In these visions, Amos acts as the intercessor for the people in much the same way Moses does in Exodus 32, verses 11 through 14. The conflict between Amos and the priest Amaziah is of note. Beginning in Amos 7:10, the priest challenges Amos's work in front of the king. He calls Amos a hoseh, a seer, which is a synonym for navi or prophet, and implies that Amos is using his prophetic trade for gain. Amos, who has established himself as a shepherd and dresser of trees, he does have a day job. He doesn't need to make this work to make ends meet. Explains that he has been called to prophesy, not to be a prophet. For modern day ministers, Amos may be the great example of the value of being vocational. The final vision in the book of Amos pictures God poised as a judge. We see this in Amos 9, 1 through 10. Here, That the presence of God in the temple does not exempt the people from God's judgment is important. Yahweh rules heaven, and it is Yahweh who brings judgment, even in the places and to the people who expect peace. The book of Amos closes with images of Israel restored to a fertile land. This type of promised restoration reminds the reader of the promises of plenty made in Deuteronomy 8. McConville suggests Amos's prominent place in the Book of the 12 is owed to the lead he gave on justice and righteousness as an imperative in the life of God's people. Moreover, scholars have found it almost impossible to explain Amos's meaning without reference to large parts of the Torah. Amos shows that Israel's obligations to the poor arise out of their creation and covenant relationships and traditions. Now let's consider Isaiah and Micah, two of the prophets of the 8th century. You're probably familiar with Isaiah and Micah and the books ascribed to them. Like Isaiah, Micah is a Judean. While Isaiah is from Jerusalem, however, Micah is from the smaller town of Moresheth Gath in southern Judah. Micah speaks from a much less urbane perspective than does Isaiah. Most people forget about Micah and the book named after him. They even forget that they're in the Bible. That may be because Micah is a collection of oracles. You're familiar with oracles, so that a prophet would offer oracles is not out of the ordinary. What is unique about Micah and his oracles is that they are arranged in an alternating pattern. This chart highlights this pattern. And I encourage you to spend a moment in the text to get a greater sense of how these oracles are laid out. Old Testament scholar Michael Coogan represents those scholars who are interested in unearthing the modern-day relevance of this ancient text. These scholars suggest that Micah 7:8 through 10 refers to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, and the mention of rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall in 711 refers to the activity of Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE. Micah approaches the Assyrian conquest a bit differently from other prophets we have encountered. In addition to the alternating pattern of the oracles, here are some things of note about Micah. We have a collection or a variety of genres. There's lament, theophany, and hymnic prayer. The covenant lawsuit, we see this in Micah 6:1 through 8. We've seen it before. Look closely at the 6th chapter and that covenant lawsuit. The lawsuit begins with an address to the mountains and hills, which reminds readers of the olden gods in the list of divine witnesses of the Suzerainty Treaty of the ancient Near East. The lawsuit continues with a summary of what Yahweh has done for Israel from the Exodus to the entry into the Promised Land, echoing the historical prologue treaties. And we see this in verses 3 through 5. It concludes with the requirement of justice and kindness, that is, covenant fidelity rather than sacrifice. And we see this laid out in verses 6 through 8. Micah's 7th century contemporary is the prophet Isaiah. The 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah form a cohesive unit in the Jewish and Christian canons, but internal indications of diversity have led critical scholarship to distinguish three major works of literature in the book of Isaiah. First Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39. Second Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55. And third Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, are now generally treated as separate writings or collections of distinct authors. We are most interested in First Isaiah. The nature of the book of Isaiah as an anthology is clear from its length, from the arrangement of the materials in it, and from overlaps within the book with other biblical books. For example, Isaiah 2 overlaps with Micah 4, with only slight variations. Isaiah 15 through 16 and Jeremiah 48 are both oracles against Moab, and Isaiah 36 through 39 incorporates the account of the invasion of Sennacherib from the Deuteronomistic history found in 2 Kings 18. The principles of arrangement of First Isaiah are neither chronological nor self-evident. Let's briefly review the contents of First Isaiah. We've got the Isaiah Apocalypse, which is a mythological account of the divine judgment of the end times, probably written no earlier than the 6th century BCE. We have the post-exilic material, chapters 34 and 35, which includes an attack on Edom and descriptions of the return of the exile from Babylon, which actually anticipates a theme found in 2nd Isaiah. And then in 2 Kings 18 through 20, reference at the end of 1st Isaiah supports the scholarly consensus that what follows 2nd Isaiah is later in origin. This slide outlines the broad contents of Micah and 1st Isaiah. 1st Isaiah can be dated to the time of an 8th century prophet living in Jerusalem whose words were recorded and preserved probably by disciples. 1st Isaiah is viewed by some as accurately depicting the historical and political events during the lifetime and from the perspective of the 8th century prophet Isaiah. Again, 1st Isaiah contains a hodgepodge of oracles, narratives, and post-exilic additions, arranged in no clear or consistent chronology. A couple of interesting things about 1st Isaiah include it does not open with an account of the call of the prophet. You have to read all the way over to the 6th chapter of Isaiah to encounter the call. Metaphor of the lawsuit or the covenant lawsuit found throughout the Hebrew Bible, this covenant lawsuit is a distinct rhetorical device in which Yahweh sues for breach of contract, that is, for violation of the Sinai covenant. We see this in Hosea as well as Isaiah 3, 13 through 15. The Lord rises to argue his lawsuit and stands to judge the peoples. And we have the royal ideology. This is a cluster of concepts that derived from, supported, and shaped the institution of the monarchy. The ideology advances the idea that 1. Yahweh guarantees the security of Israel and David's house or dynasty. 2. The king was chosen by Yahweh and has a special relationship described by the metaphor of sonship. And 3. The dynastic guarantee is an everlasting covenant. Someone from David's lineage will always sit on the throne. Within the Hebrew Bible, the authors of the Nevi'im, the prophets, identify many individuals as prophets. You've read Gaffney, so much of this is not new to you. Deborah is called a prophet in Judges 4:4. Samuel is called a prophet. The prophets of Gad, Nathan, Jonah, Isaiah, and Huldah serve as royal advisors in Kings, 1 Kings 16. The prophet Yehu receives a divine disclosure, and Elijah and Elisha are a master disciple pair of wander working prophets whose saga spans the book of Kings. The prophet Micaiah dissents from the opinion of the larger prophets community when advising the kings of Israel and is struck by an opposing prophet, Zedekiah. We see this in 1 Kings 22. Also know there are prophetic guilds, which would be professional groups really, with an unknown number of members. We've covered a great deal of material in this lecture. I know it is a lot to take in. Your class notes, the supplemental videos, and your readings should help solidify the material for you. But here's what I want you to remember. What makes an individual a prophet? What are the markers of a biblical prophet? Context. To what historical events and social concerns were the biblical prophets responding? And finally, the particular perspectives of each prophet makes a difference. The prophets are not homogeneous in their approaches. Thank you for your time and attention.